The Vareth warship entered the Sol system without a transponder signal. That alone was a provocation. Every vessel operating in contested or claimed space was required under the Compact of 70 Worlds to broadcast identification before crossing a system's heliosphere. The Vareth knew the rule. Everyone in the Compact knew it. They simply had decided, apparently, that humans were not worth the formality. Lieutenant Commander Priya Nair was on duty at Helios Watch Station when the contact appeared on her long-range array. She had been reviewing maintenance logs, which made the moment feel absurdly ordinary. A blip on a screen. A mass signature where there should have been nothing. She ran the automated identification query twice, got nothing back both times, and then reached for the general alert toggle with the measured calm of someone who had trained for exactly this scenario and had never actually wanted it to arrive. Within 4 minutes, Annette Coventry was braking from her patrol ellipse at 1/3 thrust, moving to intercept. Within 12, Admiral Yusuf Okafor was awake at Fleet Command in Geneva, drinking terrible instant coffee from a paper cup while his staff assembled a picture of what, exactly, was bearing down on the inner system. The ship was a Vareth dreadnought of the Sovereign class. There were 11 of them in service. They were, by any conventional measure, the most powerful vessels in known space. Each one displaced roughly 8 times the mass of humanity's largest warship. Each one was armed with weapons capable of cracking the crust of a moon. The Vareth had built them specifically, as far as intelligence suggested, so that they would never have to use them. The ships were arguments. You won negotiations by parking one in orbit and waiting for the other side to notice how the light bent around it. Humanity had been a member of the Compact for 19 years. In that time, the Vareth had sent a dreadnought to 7 different species. 6 had offered significant concessions within 72 hours. The 7th, the Iraqi, had panicked and fired on the vessel. The Iraqi home system was now a protectorate. No one mentioned the Iraqi much anymore. The dreadnought, which eventually identified itself by the name that translated roughly as unmoved, held at 1.4 million kilometers from Earth and did nothing else. No hail. No communication of any kind. It simply waited, vast and patient, while every telescope on the sunward side of the planet turned toward it. On the 3rd day of silence, the Vareth Embassy in Geneva transmitted a single message to the United Nations Earth Defense Force. It contained no diplomatic framing, no greeting, no title or salutation. It said, "The Terran sovereignty claims mining rights to the Kepler 442 asteroid field under Compact Article 31. The Vareth hegemony disputes this claim and requests resolution. The unmoved will remain in the Sol system until the matter is resolved to our satisfaction." The message was, in the understated assessment of Dr. Amara Osei, the ANET's chief diplomatic analyst, a remarkable document. In a longer memo she sent to Admiral Okafor, she was more precise. The Vareth were not actually in dispute about the asteroid field. They did not need the resources. The field had been surveyed by a Terran geological team, flagged under Article 31, and registered without objection 14 months ago. The Vareth had raised no challenge during the registration period. The dispute was manufactured. The dreadnought was not there because of Kepler 442. The dreadnought was there because the Vareth had decided that 19 years of quiet, unremarkable human membership in the Compact was long enough, and that it was time for humanity to learn what its actual position in the galaxy was. Admiral Okafor read the memo, set down his coffee, and asked Dr. Osei how many species had simply ignored a dreadnought when one was sent. She told him none. He nodded slowly. "There's always a first," he said, and went to brief the Secretary General. What happened over the following 11 days would be studied at every major military academy in the Compact for the next century. Not because it involved any shooting. It involved almost none. It became a case study not in warfare but in something rarer and in many ways more difficult. The willingness to be frightened, to know you are frightened, and to act with precision anyway. The first thing the ANEDF did was nothing. They did not scramble additional warships. They did not issue a counter-statement. They did not move civilian shipping lanes, which would have signaled disruption and given the Vareth the visible anxiety they were looking for. Admiral Okafor ordered all fleet assets to maintain normal patrol schedules. The only change was that Coventry remained at observation distance from the unmoved, which was standard procedure, and that 2 additional vessels quietly repositioned to picket points that had nothing obvious to do with the dreadnought but placed them in useful locations should anything develop. The second thing they did was more interesting. Dr. Osei began drafting a response. Not to the Vareth Embassy's message, but to the Compact Council itself. Under Article 77 of the Compact Charter, any member state could petition the Council to investigate what it called coercive positioning by another member. The article had never been invoked. It was the kind of clause that existed because someone had thought carefully about the future and written it down, not because anyone expected it to be used. The Verith had certainly never expected it to be used against them. Their legal team in the Compact Council building on Verith Prime reportedly spent 6 hours arguing internally about whether the article even applied before concluding, with evident discomfort, that it clearly did. Humanity filed the petition on day 4. On the unmoved, Commander Threshvan, who had overseen 6 previous dreadnought deployments and had never once seen a target species do anything other than capitulate or panic, reviewed the report from the embassy and asked her communications officer to read it again. Slowly. They filed a legal complaint, she said after a long silence. Yes, Commander. Against us. Yes, Commander. Threshvan stood at the viewport and looked at the small blue planet that sat at the edge of sensor range, wrapped in its unremarkable clouds, apparently quite calm about the 8-million-ton argument parked in its front yard. Get me the political officer, she said. Outside, at a distance that was respectful but not deferential, Annette Coventry continued her slow orbit of nothing in particular, keeping careful watch. The Compact Council chambers on Verith Prime were not designed to be uncomfortable for non-Verith species. They were simply designed by Verith, for Verith, with Verith aesthetic sensibilities, which happened to produce a space that was cold, dimly lit, geometrically severe, and faintly pressurized above what most oxygen-breathing species found pleasant. It was not malicious. It was the kind of thoughtlessness that looks, from the outside, exactly like condescension. Dr. Amara Osei had been to the chambers twice before. The first time she had spent the entire proceeding fighting a mild headache from the atmospheric pressure and trying not to show it. The second time she had taken medication beforehand and worn a discreet climate regulation layer under her formal jacket. She had also, during the intervening months, done something that turned out to matter considerably. She had read every transcript of every council proceeding for the past 40 years. All of them. Not summaries. Not the digests prepared by the diplomatic corps. The full transcripts in original language where she could access them, with translation notes flagged for ambiguity. It was approximately 12,000 hours of material. She had not read all of it personally. She had a team of 8 analysts, a very good translation algorithm, and what she described to Admiral Okafor with characteristic understatement as a lot of patience. What she found, buried in procedural records and administrative filings and the kind of bureaucratic sediment that accumulates over decades of multilateral governance, was a pattern. The Verith were meticulous. That was their great strength and, as it turned out, their most significant vulnerability. They documented everything. Every decision, every precedent, every exception to every rule was recorded and cross-referenced in the compact archives with a thoroughness that reflected a species that had been doing interstellar administration for 600 years and had developed a near-religious faith in the power of proper record-keeping. They believed, not unreasonably, that a well-maintained record was the foundation of legitimate authority. Dr. Osei agreed with them entirely. She just had a different idea about whose records were going to matter most in the next few days. The council convened on day 7. The Verith sent their second-tier diplomatic team, which was itself a message. You did not send your senior people to address a procedural complaint from a 19-year member species that had never won a contested vote and had no meaningful allies in the chamber. You sent capable professionals who could manage the formality and be home before the 3rd meal period. The delegation was led by Senior Advocate Kareth Den, who had handled 4 previous Article 77 complaints and had never lost one. He was not, in the estimation of his own government, a particularly flexible thinker, but he was thorough, he was experienced, and he understood the importance of projecting absolute certainty. Uncertainty was what you showed species who might exploit it. Not humans. He was still adjusting to the chamber pressure when Dr. Osei's opening statement began. She did not argue that the Verith dreadnought was illegal under the compact. That would have been almost impossible to prove to a council that had never ruled against the Verith on a military matter. Instead, she did something technically simpler and practically devastating. She presented a documentation request. Under Article 12 of the Compact's Administrative Code, any member state involved in a council proceeding could request the release of archived records relevant to the matter at hand. It was a discovery provision, modeled on something not unlike legal procedure, inserted into the charter during the 2nd revision and largely forgotten about because no one had ever used it aggressively. Dr. Osei had prepared a list of 47 specific document categories she was requesting. The list was extraordinary. She was requesting the full operational records for every previous dreadnought deployment. She was requesting the internal communications from the Verith Hegemony Strategic Planning Division for the 14 months prior to the unmoved's arrival. She was requesting the survey records and registration objection logs for the Kepler 442 field, which would formally establish that the Verith had raised no objection during the registration period. She was requesting the personnel files of the 6 species who had capitulated to dreadnought pressure, specifically the sections documenting what they had conceded and under what circumstances. She was, in essence, asking the Compact Council to produce a complete evidentiary record of how the Verith used military intimidation to extract concessions from smaller members. Kareth Den objected on 6 different grounds. The records were classified. The request was overly broad. The matter did not meet the threshold for discovery. The precedent would be destabilizing. The timeline for production was unreasonable. The request constituted an intrusion into hegemony's sovereign decision-making. Each objection was procedurally sound. Each one was also, as Dr. Osei calmly demonstrated, directly contradicted by prior council rulings, 3 of which had been made at Verith request and were therefore binding on the Verith hegemony under their own precedent. The Verith records, it turned out, showed exactly what she needed them to show. The council chamber was quiet in a way that Kareth Den had not experienced before. The other delegations were watching with the careful, non-committal attention of species who had long since learned not to show their reactions to Verith proceedings but who were, Dr. Osei noted, very much paying attention. The Ureth delegation, small-bodied and usually silent at the back of the gallery, had leaned forward in a way their body language generally did not permit. The council chair, a Drinath named Sulveth, called a recess. Back on Earth, Admiral Okafor was sitting in the Geneva Operations Center, watching the feed from the council chamber on a screen that was much smaller than the situation deserved. A junior analyst had brought him a cup of real coffee, which meant someone had decided this was a significant enough occasion to break out the good supply. He appreciated the gesture. On a secondary screen, the feed from Coventry showed the unmoved, unchanged, holding its position. He had authorized nothing offensive. He had made no threats. He had not moved a single ship into an aggressive posture. He had done what Dr. Osei recommended, which was to treat the entire situation as a legal matter requiring documentation, evidence, and procedure. It felt, he admitted to himself, deeply counterintuitive. A thing the size of a city was sitting 1.4 million kilometers from his planet, and his response was paperwork. But he had read Dr. Osei's analysis. He trusted her judgment. And he understood, in the part of him that had spent 30 years thinking about deterrence and strategy and the architecture of power, that what she was doing in that chamber was not paperwork at all. She was building a record. And records, as the Verith themselves believed with a faith that bordered on doctrine, were the foundation of legitimate authority. She was going to make the Veritha's own faith into the instrument of their embarrassment. He drank his coffee and waited. There is a concept in Verith political philosophy that translates, imprecisely, as the settled order. It is not quite tradition. It is not quite law. It is the accumulated weight of 600 years of dominance, the quiet understanding that certain things are true because they have always been true, because the alternative is a universe too uncertain to navigate. The Verith are the senior members of the Compact. The Verith hold 7 of the 12 permanent seats on the governance board. The Verith have the largest fleet, the most advanced weapons technology, and the longest diplomatic memory of any species currently operating in the known systems. These facts are not debated. They are assumed. Keth Moran, the Verith Hegemony's Director of External Relations, had spent 43 years operating inside this settled order. She had negotiated trade agreements, resolved territorial disputes, managed the aftermath of the Iraqi situation with what she considered appropriate firmness, and overseen the Dreadnought program with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that the program's value was precisely its infrequency of actual use. You did not send a Dreadnought to destroy anything. You sent it to remind the other party of what destruction looked like. She had not been alarmed when the humans filed the Article 77 petition. She had been mildly irritated, in the way you are irritated by a bureaucratic complication that will cost you time but not outcome. She had assigned Kareth Den because he was reliable and because the matter did not, in her assessment, require her personal attention. She revised that assessment at hour 6 of the first recess. The summary her legal team produced was 3 pages. She read it twice. Then she called her senior strategic advisor, a blunt and undecorated official named Torves, and asked him what he thought. They found the records, Torves said. I understand that. What do they intend to do with them? Publish them, I assume. Or enter them into the council archive as part of the proceedings, which amounts to the same thing. Every member of the compact will have access. Kethmaran was quiet for a moment. The records don't show anything illegal. No, Torves agreed. They show everything that is legal. That's the problem. She understood what he meant. The records showed the Verith operating exactly as they had always operated, with precision and documentation and thoroughness, and what that documentation revealed, when assembled in sequence and submitted to a formal proceeding, was a systematic pattern of coercive behavior toward smaller members. Nothing in the record violated the Compact Charter. But the Compact Charter, notably, did not govern the court of political opinion among the 46 member species who would read those records and draw their own conclusions. The Verith had 600 years of accumulated authority. That authority rested on a combination of genuine capability and perceived legitimacy. The capability was not in question. The legitimacy, assembled from 600 years of being seen as the senior responsible stewards of interstellar order, was somewhat more fragile than it looked. The humans had apparently understood this. Which was, Kethmaran reflected with a kind of cold respect, rather clever for a species that had been in space for less than a century. She requested a private channel to the human delegation. Dr. Osei took the call in a side chamber with her deputy, a quiet man named Kwame Asante who had the useful habit of writing down everything anyone said and had brought 3 notebooks to the council complex. The Verith director appeared on the communication screen with the composed, still expression that senior Verith officials used as a professional mask, but Dr. Osei had read enough transcripts to recognize what lay beneath it. Kethmaran opened with a formality which was protocol. Then she said without further preamble, "What is it that you actually want?" Dr. Osei had prepared for this question. She had, in fact, prepared for it more carefully than any other single element of the proceeding, because she knew it would come, and she knew that the answer would define not just the outcome of this situation but the shape of every interaction between her species and the Verith for the next 50 years. She said, "We want the compact to function as designed." Kethmaran waited. "We want Article 31 registrations to be respected during and after the registration period. We want dispute resolution to follow the procedures defined in the Charter. We want member states to be free to exercise their registered rights without the presence of warships in their home systems." Dr. Osei paused. "We are not asking for the Verith to be diminished. We are asking for the compact to be what it says it is." There was a silence of perhaps 10 seconds, which in diplomatic exchange is a very long time. "And the document request?" Kethmaran asked. "Remains active unless the council produces a ruling that makes it unnecessary." Another pause. "You understand what releasing those records would do?" "I understand what it would show," Dr. Osei said carefully. "What it would do depends entirely on choices your government makes from this point forward." Back on Earth, the unmoved continued its silent vigil at 1.4 million kilometers. On Coventry, Captain Adiz Izigu drank cold tea and watched the sensor returns and thought about the fact that she was approximately the only military asset standing between that ship and anything it might decide to do, which was not a thought she found comfortable, and which she had decided some days ago to simply stop having. She was good at her job. Her crew was good at their jobs. They had their orders, which were to observe and report and not, under any circumstances, to do anything that could be interpreted as aggressive. Those orders were sensible. She trusted the people who had given them. She still did not entirely love being this close to something that size. In the council chamber, Kethmaran ended the call without a commitment. But the fact that she had made it at all told Dr. Osei something important. The director was calculating. She was not certain. She was considering outcomes she had not considered before this proceeding began. That was not the behavior of someone who thought she was winning. Dr. Osei returned to the main chamber and sat down at the Terran delegation table and said nothing to anyone for a few minutes, which her deputy Asante recognized as meaning she was thinking carefully and should not be interrupted. He opened his notebook to a fresh page and waited. Outside the great windows of the council complex, the twin moons of Verith Prime were rising in a sky the color of old copper. It was, by any measure, a beautiful planet. The Verith had governed it well for 600 years, and had extended that governance outward until it encompassed a significant portion of the known galaxy. Dr. Osei did not want to break anything. She wanted to fix something. The distinction felt important, and she intended to keep it important for as long as this proceeding lasted. She picked up her pen and wrote a single line in her own notebook. "They are thinking. That is enough for today." The Compact Council recess extended past its scheduled end. This was unusual. Recesses lasted between 2 and 6 hours as a rule. Anything longer indicated that something was being negotiated that the participants did not want on the public record. The clerk's office issued 3 successive notifications extending the pause, each phrased in language of such administrative neutrality that it communicated almost nothing, which was its precise intent. In practice, what was happening during those 37 hours was something that had not happened in the Compact Council complex in living memory. A major power was being asked to justify itself, and was finding the process more difficult than it had anticipated. Kethmaran had assembled her full legal and strategic team in a secure conference facility on the 3rd level of the Varith embassy. She had also, through channels that would not appear in any formal record, reached out to 3 other permanent member delegations to take their temperature. The responses had been cautious and carefully worded and, when she stripped away the diplomatic formality, pointed in the same uncomfortable direction. None of them wanted to be seen voting against the human petition. Not because they particularly sympathized with humans. The Ureth and the Drinath and the Sultar were not sentimental species. They had their own complicated histories with the Varith, their own carefully managed relationships, their own calculations about where their interests lay. But the document request was sitting on the table, and if the records were released, those documents would contain material that touched on every one of them. Past negotiations. Past concessions. Past moments when a very large ship had appeared near one of their worlds and certain decisions had subsequently been made. The humans had, entirely by accident or entirely by design, created a situation in which every species in the compact had a private reason to want the proceedings resolved on terms that did not involve a full documentary release. Torves briefed Kethmaran on this at hour 18. She listened without expression. "They've unified the gallery against us," she said. "Not against us. The gallery doesn't want to go against us. They want to avoid the release. Which means they'll support a resolution that avoids it." "Yes. Which means they'll support a resolution on terms the humans can accept." "Effectively, yes." Kethmaran stood and moved to the window. Outside, the capital city moved in its ordinary patterns, traffic and light and the low hum of a civilization that had been doing this for a very long time. She thought about the settled order. She thought about what it had cost to build it and what it would cost to maintain it and what it would cost, in a different way, to defend it here in terms that the rest of the compact would remember. "What do the humans want?" Torves asked. "They told me. They want the compact to function as designed." "That's a principle, not a demand." "Yes," she agreed. They were careful about that. She was quiet for a moment. "Get me the specific language of their Article 77 filing. The relief section." He brought it to her. She read it 3 times. It was, she had to acknowledge, drafted with real skill. It did not ask for punishment. It did not ask for apology. It asked for a council ruling affirming that Article 31 registrations were binding during and after the registration period, and that the presence of warships in a member's home system during an ongoing dispute constituted coercive positioning under the Charter's definitions. It asked for the unmoved to depart Sol within 72 hours of any such ruling. It asked for nothing that was not already technically true under the existing Charter. It was asking the Council to say out loud what everyone already knew was written down. That was the elegant and infuriating thing about it. There was nothing in the human request that required the Varith to admit wrongdoing. There was nothing that required them to apologize or pay restitution or acknowledge that the Dreadnought program had been anything other than a legitimate military capability that happened to have been deployed in a manner the Council was now defining as procedurally inappropriate. They just had to leave. And the Council had to say, formally and on the record, that the Charter meant what it said. Kethmaran understood, with the clarity that came from 43 years of doing this work, what was actually being asked. Not for the Varith to be humiliated. For the Varith to accept a constraint. A real one. A documented one that would live in the archive and be cited for the next century every time someone tried to use a warship as a negotiating tool. The cost was not the departure of the unmoved. The cost was the precedent. She thought about the Iraqi. She thought about the 6 species who had conceded under dreadnought pressure and what they had given up. She thought about the 46 delegations currently watching this proceeding from a careful distance and calculating their own futures in its light. She called for her senior legal counsel and told her to begin drafting a joint resolution framework. On Sol's outer edge at Helios Watch, Lieutenant Commander Nair was 11 days into the most unusual watch rotation of her career and was handling it by doing her job with exceptional thoroughness. She had logged more sensor readings in the past week than in the previous 3 months combined. Her reports were precise, detailed, and completely devoid of anything that could be interpreted as alarm, which was a deliberate choice and required more discipline than it appeared. On day 11 at 0314 station time, the unmoved's transponder activated. It broadcast a standard identification signal, which it had not done since entering the system. Then its maneuvering drives powered up to low thrust. Nair watched the sensor returns for 90 seconds before she touched her comm. "Admiral," she said when the connection opened. "The unmoved is moving." A brief pause. "Which direction?" Nair watched the trajectory calculation resolve on her screen. "Away from us, sir. They're on a departure vector." Another pause, longer this time. "Log it," Admiral Okafor said. "And tell Coventry." "Yes, sir." She logged it. She told Coventry. She made a second cup of tea, which she had not had time for in 11 days, and sat at her console and watched the enormous ship grow slowly, incrementally smaller on her array, and thought about the fact that she had been afraid of it since the moment it appeared, and that it was now leaving, and that nothing about this outcome matched the vocabulary she had been taught to think about such situations with. No battle. No ultimatum met. No dramatic confrontation. Just a long, careful argument made in a cold chamber on a distant planet, and a ship that had decided after 11 days of waiting, that waiting was finished. The tea was good. She drank it slowly. The Ureth had a word that translated, approximately, as, the moment before understanding changes. It described the cognitive state between encountering new information and fully integrating its implications. In Ureth philosophical tradition, this state was considered sacred. You were allowed to not know, to hold the evidence without yet reshaping your beliefs around it. But you were not allowed to pretend the evidence was not there. Ambassador Vethae of the Ureth Conclave had been in the moment before understanding changes for most of the 11 days of the Soul Crisis, and was still there as he watched the Compact Council's formal resolution appear in the archive. He had been a Compact diplomat for 30 years. He had seen things shift before, sometimes dramatically. The Iraqi situation had shifted things. The admission of the 3 Outer Rim species 30 years ago had shifted things. But those shifts had happened in ways that confirmed existing structures. The powerful remained powerful, the careful remained safe, the bold occasionally gained and occasionally lost. This was different in texture. The humans had not gained territory. They had not gained trade concessions. The formal resolution on the screen was, by any measure, minimal, a clarification of existing charter provisions, a ruling that the unmoved's presence had constituted coercive positioning, and a 60-day timeline for the Vareth to present a voluntary code of conduct for military asset deployment near member worlds. The Vareth had agreed to all of it. There had been no formal admission of bad conduct. The language was scrupulously neutral. And yet, Vethae pulled up the archive record of the full proceedings. He had access to most of it already as a senior member of the Ureth delegation, and he read through it the way you read a document when you are looking not for the content but for what the content reveals about the people who produced it. What he found was thorough preparation. Not luck. Not improvisation. The human team had arrived in the council complex with 47 categories of document requests precisely specified, with legal precedents already identified for each of their procedural arguments, with a demand structured to minimize the Vareth's face loss while maximizing the binding nature of the outcome. They had made it easy for the Vareth to agree, which was what made the agreement likely to hold. That was craft. 600-year craft, the kind the Vareth usually brought to these proceedings. He dictated a note to his government. It was 2 paragraphs, which was brief by Ureth diplomatic standards. The first paragraph described what had happened. The second paragraph said, "The humans have been in space for less than 100 years. They are already thinking like they intend to be here for the next 1,000. We should consider whether our treaty with them reflects that reality." The note went out that evening. He was not the only one making similar assessments. The Drinath Council of Voices held an internal review of the proceedings and produced a 40-page analysis that circulated among their senior membership. Its central finding was characteristically Drinath in its precision. The Terran delegation demonstrated a command of compact procedural architecture that exceeds their apparent level of experience. This suggests either extraordinary preparation or a depth of institutional thinking that has not been visible in prior interactions. Both possibilities warrant reassessment of Terran negotiation posture in future dealings. The Sultar Foreign Ministry sent a back-channel inquiry to the Terran diplomatic mission within 48 hours of the Council's ruling. The inquiry was framed as a request for a routine exchange of information on compact procedural history, which was technically accurate and also a very specific kind of diplomatic signal. It meant, "We noticed. We are interested. Let us talk." Dr. Osei received the Sultar inquiry in her office in Geneva, 3 days after returning from Vareth Prime. She had slept well for the first time since the unmoved appeared on Nair's sensor array. She was drinking good coffee, reading her messages, and was moderately but not excessively pleased with how things had gone. The Sultar inquiry made her pause. Kwame Asante was at his own desk across the room, writing up final notes on the proceedings. She called him over and showed him the message. "You read it?" Then he said, "They want to know if we know what we're doing. Basically. Do you want me to draft a response?" "Yes. Something that confirms we received it and suggests a meeting in about 6 weeks. Keep it warm but not eager." 6 weeks, he repeated. "Not 2. 2 looks eager. 6 looks like we have other things going on." Asante smiled and went back to his desk. Dr. Osei turned to her window. Geneva in November was gray and damp, the lake barely visible through low cloud, the old buildings of the city going about their ordinary business below. She had grown up in Accra, had done her graduate work in Singapore, had spent the last 8 years doing a job that most people could not precisely describe when she tried to explain it at family gatherings. Her mother still referred to it as working at the United Nations, which was true enough. She thought about the UREF delegate, Vethe, who had watched the proceedings from the gallery with an attention that had not escaped her notice. She thought about the other delegations, the careful body language, the way the room had changed in temperature and quality between her opening statement and the recess. She thought about the document request, which had never been fulfilled because the council's ruling had made it unnecessary, and which therefore sat in the archive as a possibility rather than a reality, a loaded question that had been answered by the act of asking it. The Verith had not been defeated. She wanted to be careful about that framing, both in her own head and in every conversation she had about this going forward. A defeated great power was dangerous and unstable. A great power that had accepted a constraint in a proceeding that gave it every face-saving option available was something different. A party to a precedent with a stake in the precedent holding. That was the architecture she had been trying to build. Not a victory. A structure. Whether it would hold was a different question, and not one she could answer from Geneva in November. It would hold if the next interaction went well and the one after that and the one after that. Diplomatic structures were not built in a single brilliant proceeding. They were built in years of subsequent behavior, each exchange either reinforcing or eroding the foundation. She had 11 days of work to show. She had a precedent in the archive. She had a Sultar inquiry on her desk and she suspected a few more like it incoming in the weeks ahead. It was a beginning. She had learned over 8 years of this work, not to mistake beginnings for endings. She finished her coffee and started drafting the agenda for the next 6 months. The Unmoved reached Verith Prime on day 19. Commander Threshvan filed her operational report the same morning, before the formal debrief, before the political review, before any of the meetings that were already accumulating on her calendar like weather before a front. She filed it early because she was a methodical person and because she wanted the record to be hers, written in her own words without the benefit of hindsight or the pressure of subsequent conversations, while the experience was still present and unmediated. The report was 18 pages. The first 12 covered operational parameters in the detail her mission logs required. The transit to Seoul, the positioning data, the standard surveillance logs, the communication traffic, the departure sequence. It was thorough and professionally unremarkable. The last 6 pages were different. She had been writing operational reports for 28 years. She had never before included a section she titled, Assessment of Target Response. She included it now because she felt, with the conviction of someone who had made 6 previous deployments and understood the program's theory of effect as well as anyone alive, that what she had observed in the Seoul system was significant in a way that the standard report structure could not capture. She wrote, the Terran response to the Unmoved's deployment differed from all prior target responses in the following material respects. She listed 6. The first was behavioral discipline. In 6 previous deployments, the target species had made visible changes to their civilian and military patterns within 48 hours. Shipping lanes adjusted, military assets repositioned, public communications reflecting either heightened alarm or performative calm. The humans had done none of these things. Their shipping ran on schedule. Their military assets maintained routine patrol patterns. Their public communications neither spiked nor flattened in a way that indicated coordinated management. She had monitored 37 different communication channels during the 11 days and the baseline patterns held with a consistency that was, she wrote, either the product of extraordinary institutional discipline or evidence that the response was being coordinated at a level below what our monitoring could detect. The second was the legal filing. She spent 3 paragraphs on this because it was what she thought about most often. No previous target had done anything remotely similar. Most had not had the compact procedural knowledge to attempt it. Those that might have had the knowledge had not, apparently, considered it as a first response to a dreadnought. The humans had filed within 4 days, before making any military adjustment whatsoever. This sequence struck her as important. They had treated the situation as a legal problem requiring a legal solution, and they had pursued that solution before doing anything else. She wrote, "This ordering of priorities suggests a strategic culture that places institutional process above immediate tactical response. Whether this reflects confidence, restraint, or a genuine assessment that the legal path was most likely to succeed is not clear from the available data. Possibly all three." The third was the document request itself. She described it and its probable effects on the gallery delegations and noted that she had, on day 8, requested a full briefing from the political officer on the compact archive records relevant to prior dreadnought deployments. The political officer had been forthcoming, and what she had learned had confirmed something she had already begun to suspect. The humans had read the archive more thoroughly than the Verith had read the humans. The 4th, 5th, and 6th points were briefer, but she wanted them in the record. The 4th was the behavior of Annette Coventry. Professional, consistent, never provocative, maintaining observation at a distance that said, "We are watching," without saying "we are threatening." The 5th was the message framing in the relief section of the human filing, which sought no penalty and no apology and gave the hegemony every available path to compliance that did not require admission of misconduct. The 6th was the 6-week timeline the human delegation had requested for the Sultar meeting, which had been intercepted by compact intelligence, and which Threshvan cited as evidence that they were managing their new diplomatic relationships with the same calibrated patience they had brought to the crisis itself. She concluded, "It is my assessment that the Terran response to the Sol deployment represents a qualitative departure from prior target behavior patterns and that the Dreadnought program's theory of effect does not adequately account for a species with this response profile. I recommend a full strategic review before any further deployment to Terran proximate systems." She submitted the report, made herself a cup of tea, and sat looking at the planet her species had called home for 600 years. The review she had recommended was, she suspected, going to be complicated. Not because it would involve difficult questions about the future of the Dreadnought program, though it would. The difficult part was going to be the implied question underneath those questions. What else had they assumed about the humans that was simply wrong? She didn't know the answer. That was the point of the review. She drank her tea and thought about the small blue planet sitting at 1.4 million kilometers from her ship, on the other side of the display that was now showing normal space, and the small figure standing at a sensor console on a watch station at the edge of that system, logging the departure of a vessel that could have ended everything she knew, and doing it with the steady precision of someone who had decided, for reasons Threshvan was still working to understand, that this was just another part of the job. There was something in that she wanted to understand better. She flagged the report as priority distribution to strategic planning and went to her next meeting. 3 months after the unmoved departed Sol, the Compact Council published its first binding interpretation of the coercive positioning provision. It was 12 pages. It had been drafted by a committee of 7, including 2 Terran legal advisors, a Drinath proceduralist, a Sultar treaty specialist and 3 permanent member staffers. The language was careful and precise and had been negotiated over 11 weeks of working sessions, and it said, in terms that every member of the Compact could now cite, that the presence of a military asset in a member state's home system during an unresolved dispute constituted coercive positioning unless the asset was there by mutual agreement or in response to a formal security request. It did not mention the Verith. It did not mention the unmoved. It did not mention humans. It was charter interpretation, formally neutral, applicable to everyone equally, which was the only kind of document that actually held. Dr. Osei read the final published version in her Geneva office on a Tuesday morning in February, with the lake visible and gray through the window and a cup of tea going cold on her desk because she had forgotten it. She read it twice. Then she sent a copy to Admiral Okafor with a single line, "For the archive." He wrote back, "Logged." That was the whole exchange. It was enough. The 3 months since the Sol crisis had been, in ways both visible and invisible, a different kind of busy than the 11 days themselves. The crisis had required presence and nerve and preparation. The aftermath required patience and consistency and the willingness to let things develop at a pace that no single person controlled. The Sultar meeting had happened in week 7, not week 6. They had requested the extra week for scheduling reasons, which Dr. Osei had agreed to without comment. It had gone well. The Sultar were interested in discussing compact procedural history, as their initial inquiry had suggested, But they were more specifically interested in discussing the documentary research methodology her team had used to prepare the Article 77 filing. There was an interstellar equivalent of professional respect in the way their lead delegate described what her team had done, and Dr. Osei had accepted it graciously and provided a detailed account of the process, including which archives they had searched and how they had organized the research. The Sultar delegate had taken extensive notes. The Ureth had been in contact 3 weeks later. Not through formal diplomatic channels, but through a side conversation at a separate compact event, which was the way the Ureth signaled that they wanted to talk without the conversation appearing in anyone's formal record. Ambassador Vethasea had spent 90 minutes with Dr. Osei in a small meeting room off the main conference hall and had asked her, with characteristic Ureth directness, what the humans wanted to be. It was a strange question put like that. She had thought about it before he finished asking it. The same things everyone wants, she had said. Security. The ability to develop without interference. Fair treatment under the frameworks we've agreed to. And in the compact specifically? To participate in the compact as it is written. Not as it has sometimes been practiced. Vethasea had been quiet for a moment. There are 14 member species who would say the same thing if asked. I know. They don't say it. They haven't had cause to say it in a way that created a useful precedent, she replied. We did. The cause came to us. We didn't choose the timing. But you chose the response. Yes. He had nodded, the Ureth gesture for acknowledgement that implies neither agreement nor disagreement. Then he had said, your response created something useful for the 14. That is noted. That conversation had stayed with her. Not because it promised anything specific. The Ureth did not make promises in side conversations off conference hall corridors. But because it confirmed something she had believed from the beginning. The Soul Crisis was not only about Kepler, 442 or the unmoved or the humans. It was about a structure that many species had been living inside for a long time and that had been maintained not because everyone found it fair but because no one had found a way to challenge it that did not look like either capitulation or war. The humans had found a third option. That was what the 14 had noticed. Not the outcome of this specific case but the existence of the path. She had not created the path. It had been in the charter all along, written there by people 600 years ago who had built a system with dispute resolution mechanisms and documentation requirements and procedural safeguards because they understood that the powerful always find it easy to act and the less powerful always need a structure to stand on. The humans had simply read the charter carefully enough to find what was already there. Admiral Okafor had asked her once, during the crisis, whether she thought the Vareth would actually respond to legal pressure rather than simply overriding it. She had thought about the question before answering. They built the archive, she had said. They wrote down every decision they made for 600 years because they believed that a well-maintained record was the foundation of legitimate authority. They believe in the records. If they didn't, they would have destroyed the ones that were inconvenient. They kept them, which means they believe in what the records represent. And what do they represent? That the compact is real. That the rules are real. That 600 years of documented decision-making means something. She had paused. If the Vareth let a 19-year member invoke those records and then simply ignored the result, they would be saying the compact is not real. They are not willing to say that. It's too much of what they are. Okafor had considered this. You were betting on their consistency. I was betting on their beliefs, she had said. Which is usually a safer bet. Lieutenant Commander Nair sent Dr. Osei a message 3 months after the crisis. A professional courtesy note that was technically within protocol for an officer whose watch station had logged the first contact. The note was brief and well-written and at the end of the professional content contained a single personal line. I've been trying to figure out what the right word is for what happened. The closest I've found is architecture. I hope that makes sense. Dr. Osei wrote back, it makes complete sense. Thank you for the watch. Architecture. Yes, that was close. Not a victory. Not a demonstration of strength, though it had demonstrated something. Not a performance of human determination, though determination had been part of it. A structure built from what was already available, assembled carefully and maintained with patience, that would stand as a foundation for what came next. The compact's first binding coercive positioning interpretation. A precedent in the archive. 14 species that had watched and noted the existence of a path. A Vareth strategic review that Threshvan's report had initiated and that would, over the next few years, produce changes in how the Dreadnought program was used that no one would ever formally attribute to the Soul Crisis but that would trace from it as clearly as a line on a map. Dr. Osei walked home through Geneva that evening, through streets that knew nothing of what had been built in their name, Past the old buildings and the cold lake and the ordinary lights of a city doing what cities do. Going about its business, expecting the world to continue, trusting that someone was paying attention. She was paying attention. The work was not finished. It was never finished. But it was a foundation, and foundations were where you started, and starting was what mattered now. She walked home through the gray February evening and thought about what came next, which was a very long list and which she found, despite everything, energizing rather than exhausting. There was a lot still to do. She was glad there was.